Hello and welcome back. Tonight we are going to do something a little self-indulgent, and I say that with absolutely zero apology, because I think this is the kind of conversation that deserves to happen at this hour in the dark, with nothing pressing to do and nowhere you have to be. We are going to talk about The Walking Dead. Specifically, we are going to talk about the episodes that didn't quite work, the ones that critics and fans and pretty much everyone who watched them looked at and thought, right, okay, that wasn't it. The duds, the wheel spinners, the episodes that felt like the show was marking time until it could get back to doing something interesting. Now, before we go any further, I want to say something clearly, because I think it matters. Pointing out the weaker moments in a show you love is not the same as saying the show is bad. In fact, I'd argue it's the opposite. You don't analyse the failures of something you didn't care about. You just stop watching. The fact that we're here, at this hour, going through these episodes one by one, that's proof of something. That's proof that The Walking Dead got into us in a way that very few television shows managed to do. And it did get into people. Properly. Deeply. When The Walking Dead premiered on AMC in October 2010, it arrived like nothing else on cable television at the time. That first episode, a man waking up alone in a hospital, the world already over, a little girl in a nightgown shuffling through a car park, was as confident an opening as any drama had managed in years. By the time the show hit its peak, in seasons 3, 4 and 5, it was drawing audiences that genuinely shocked the television industry. Ratings that hadn't been seen on cable since, well, arguably ever. The season 5 premiere in 2014 pulled in over 17 million same-day viewers, which for a cable drama in the streaming era was an extraordinary number by any measure. The cultural presence of the show in the early to mid-2010s was something specific and a bit difficult to convey if you weren't living through it. The Walking Dead wasn't just a show people watched. It was a show people talked about at work on Monday morning, debated on forums late into the night, wrote essay-length analyses of in comment sections that were 17 pages long. There were people who'd never shown any previous interest in horror television who were suddenly extremely invested in whether a given character was going to make it through an episode. That kind of cross-genre audience pull is genuinely rare, and the show achieved it by doing what the best television drama does, by making you care about specific people in impossible circumstances, so completely that the genre scaffolding around it became secondary. It also, as any show that runs for 12 years will, had its rough patches. Some rougher than others. 11 seasons across more than a decade is simply too much television for any creative team, however talented, however committed, to sustain without variance. There will be episodes that exceed the standard the show has set for itself. There will be episodes that fall short of it. The interesting question is always which kind of shortfall is which, and what each failure mode reveals about the show's specific vulnerabilities. And there's something genuinely worthwhile about sitting with those failures carefully, at no particular speed, at the end of a long day in the dark. Which means when it had bad episodes, it had them at scale. When the show stumbled, it stumbled in front of an audience of millions of people who had invested years of their viewing lives in these characters and this world. And that investment, which is worth sitting with for a moment, is exactly what made the weaker episodes sting as much as they did. Here's what I find genuinely interesting about this project, though. When you sit down and go through the episodes that didn't work, a pattern starts to emerge. It's not random. It's not just the occasional misfire you get in any long-running drama. The bad episodes of The Walking Dead tend to share certain qualities. There's a particular kind of failure that the show was susceptible to, a specific way it went wrong when it went wrong, and understanding that tells you something real about the show, about what it needed to succeed and what happened when those conditions weren't met. The show's best episodes work because they're about choices, not plot choices, character choices, moments where a person has to decide who they are under conditions that make that decision almost impossible. Shane choosing to frame Otis rather than die with him, Carol making the decision she makes in the Grove, Rick in the barn at the end of Better Angels, Herschel staying in the prison wing trying to keep people alive during the illness arc. The show understood, at its most lucid, that the walkers weren't the story. They were the pressure system that made the story unavoidable. The dead were a context that stripped everything down to its most essential. Who are you, and what will you do? The bad episodes forget this. They focus on the movement of pieces rather than the meaning of choices. They put characters in situations without asking what those situations cost them, or reveal about them. They fill runtime with logistics, and the result is an episode that is technically a piece of The Walking Dead, but doesn't feel like it. Because what made The Walking Dead feel like itself was always the human question underneath the horror. And when that question isn't being asked, the horror is just furniture. But we're not in a rush tonight. We're going to meander through this in a pretty relaxed way. We've got a lot of ground to cover. 11 seasons is an enormous amount of television. And there are episodes scattered throughout the run that are worth talking about for various reasons, some more embarrassing than others. We'll go roughly in order, moving through the seasons as they aired, stopping when something deserves a proper look. If you're a subscriber, lovely to have you back. If you're new tonight, feel free to subscribe if this ends up being your kind of thing. It's free and it genuinely helps. But for now, get comfortable. The lights are low, there's no urgency, and we've got 11 seasons of slightly disappointing television to talk about. One more thing before we begin properly. There's a version of this project that's purely combative, that approaches the weaker episodes of The Walking Dead with a prosecutorial energy, building a case against them, scoring points. That's not what tonight is. I've rewatched all of these episodes for this, and the experience of doing that is interesting, because even the bad ones have things in them that work. Even the genuinely weak ones, right? And we'll get to the one that most people agree is the weakest of the lot, right at the end of the night, contain moments of performance or staging or simple human feeling that remind you why the show accumulated the audience it did. The cast of The Walking Dead, across all 11 seasons, is remarkably good. Andrew Lincoln's Rick Grimes is one of the great lead performances in cable drama, and I say that without reservation. The specific way he held the character's authority and its erosion across 8 seasons, the physical precision of it, the way Rick's psychology was visible in his body language before it was visible in the writing, is the kind of performance that is easy to take for granted because it's always there, always reliable. Norman Reedus built Daryl Dixon out of what was written as a supporting character with a fairly blunt function and turned him into one of the franchise's most enduring figures. And he did that largely through the things he was doing when the script didn't give him much to do. Melissa McBride as Carol, particularly from season 4 onward, is exceptional television acting, full stop. Lauren Cohan, Stephen Yeun, Danai Gurira, Chandler Riggs, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, David Morrissey, Tova Feldscher, Scott Wilson. The list of people who did genuinely fine work in this world is long and worth acknowledging. So when an episode fails, it rarely fails because of the people in front of the camera. It usually fails because of decisions made behind it. Structural choices, pacing miscalculations, timing issues, creative priorities that turned out to be the wrong ones in retrospect. That's the kind of failure we're here to talk about tonight. Not the failure of effort, but the failure of judgment, which is in some ways the more interesting kind. Right then, let's begin. Let's start at the beginning, which, fittingly enough, is where some of the earliest warning signs appeared. The Walking Dead's first season is by and large quite good. 6 episodes, tight and purposeful, with a clarity of vision that the show would spend much of the next decade trying to recapture. Frank Darabont, who created the adaptation, had a genuine handle on what this world should feel like. Quiet and devastating and human, with the horror always present, but never overwhelming the character work underneath. Those first 6 episodes gave us Rick Grimes Waking Up Alone, gave us the extraordinary opening of the Atlanta car park, gave us Morgan and Dwayne in that first episode, in a way that still holds up, gave us the CDC storyline, which lands with real emotional weight in the finale. But there's one episode in that first season that, if you go back to it now, reads a little differently than it did at the time. And it's not a bad episode exactly, it's more of an early glimpse at something, a small crack in an otherwise solid foundation. It's called Wildfire, and it's the 5th episode of Season 1, and it aired on the 21st of November, 2010. If you remember your Season 1, subscribe and move on. If you'd like a refresher, and given that we're settling in for the night, there's no reason to rush, we'll talk about it properly. Wildfire opens in the aftermath of the camp attack from the previous episode. Amy has died, Jim has been bitten, several others are gone. The group is grieving, exhausted, and beginning to fracture along the usual lines. Shane wants practical decisions, Rick wants to hold things together, and everyone in between is trying to figure out what the rules are now. The bulk of the episode is about what to do with Jim. He's been bitten on the side, and everyone knows what that means. The question is how to handle it. Does the group try to get him to the CDC in Atlanta, which Jenna has indicated is still operational? Do they leave him? Do they, and this is the conversation nobody wants to have out loud, do they end it before the fever takes him? Jim himself eventually makes the choice. He asks to be left by the side of the road, under a tree, so that the last thing he sees isn't a ceiling. The group honours that. They leave him there and drive towards Atlanta. That's a genuinely moving piece of storytelling, to be honest. The Jim subplot in this episode is handled with real care. Andrew Rothenberg, who played Jim, gives a performance that's quiet and heartbreaking, and the scene where he's left behind has a dignity to it that the show was very good at in its early years. No big speech, no dramatic farewell, just a man choosing where to die. The problem, Addy, and it's a gentle problem, the kind that's easy to miss on a first watch, is everything around it. Wildfire is, fundamentally, a transition episode. It exists to get the group from the camp to the CDC. It exists to set up the season finale. And it does those things, but it doesn't do much else. The Shane and Rick tension is present but not developed. The rest of the group feels a bit like furniture. The Atlanta skyline appears in the distance as the episode closes, and you get the sense that the show is eager to arrive somewhere, but isn't quite sure what to do with the commute. Here's why that matters looking back. In Season 1, a transitional episode like this is perfectly forgivable. The run was only 6 episodes. The season overall was exceptional, and the finale more than made up for any ground that Wildfire failed to cover. You don't hold this against the show. You barely notice it the first time through. But the show would go on to produce 171 more episodes after this one, and quite a few of them would have the same basic problem. They exist to move pieces from one location to another without doing the character work that would make the journey worthwhile. Wildfire didn't invent that problem, it was just the first recognisable instance of it. There's also the CDC itself, which looms over the whole episode as a destination, and the CDC storyline, which pays off properly in the Season 1 finale, in Edwin Jenner's underground bunker, in that extraordinary final conversation, is genuinely one of the show's best early decisions. The idea that the only scientist still working on a cure is working alone in an automated facility that's counting down to its own destruction is exactly the kind of quietly apocalyptic image that the show did brilliantly at this stage. Jenner's revelation that everyone is already infected, that the Walker state isn't transmitted through bites but triggered by death, is one of the best pieces of lore the show ever produced. Wildfire gets credit for being the episode that makes that destination possible. It's just not a very interesting episode to actually sit through. It's also worth noting what Season 2 did with the show's pacing, since it immediately follows Wildfire's particular style of narrative patience and extends it considerably. Season 2's decision to set most of its action on Herschel's farm, a single location, with a cast that had been reduced to a manageable size, is one of the more interesting creative choices in the show's early run. It was slow, deliberately, committedly slow. The first half of season 2 is the show testing how long it can hold its audience on character tension and dialogue without external threat forcing things forward. The answer was quite a long time, actually, which surprised people. But it also established a pattern of tolerance for stillness that the show would occasionally mistake for license in later seasons when it needed to be doing more than standing still. Season 2 also, in its back half, produced some of the finest episodes in the show's entire run. Shane and Rick's final confrontation, the farm's destruction in the season finale. So even there, the slow stretches were justified by what came after them. One thing I always find myself thinking about when I revisit season 1 is Frank Darabont's departure. He was fired by AMC midway through season 2 production, in what was by all accounts an acrimonious split. Disputes over budget cuts, creative control, the usual catalogue of things that end a showrunner's tenure. Whether Darabont would have kept the show at the level of its first season is impossible to know, but season 1, for all its achievements, contains within it, even in this slightly underpowered 5th episode, the seeds of the choices that would later cause the show so much trouble. The tendency to treat transitional episodes as necessary evils rather than opportunities. The willingness to slow down when the story doesn't quite require it. None of that destroyed the show in season 1, because the show was operating from such a strong foundation, but it's interesting to see it start here, in a quiet episode about a bitten man and a group heading towards a burning city. Wildfire is the kind of episode you end up being oddly fond of, despite everything. It's small, it's slow, it's not quite working at the level the surrounding episodes are, and it's the first sign of a pattern that would become, in later seasons, rather more consequential. There's also something worth noting about what the show was navigating in season 1 that makes Wildfire more forgivable in context. The Walking Dead was, at this point in television history, doing something genuinely unusual. Horror had existed on television before, but not quite like this. Not as a prestige drama with real character investment. Not with this level of craft in the production design and direction. AMC was the network that had just given the world Mad Men and Breaking Bad, and The Walking Dead arriving on that same platform carried with it a certain implicit promise. This is serious storytelling. This is not schlocky B-movie zombie stuff. The walkers are a backdrop. The people are the point. That contract with the audience was real and meaningful in season 1. And Wildfire, for all its slowness, honours the contract at the level of its intentions, even if not always at the level of its execution. It is trying to do the serious storytelling thing. It's trying to sit with grief and uncertainty and the specific weight of a world that no longer runs by the old rules. The fact that it doesn't quite pull it off is less important than the fact that it's genuinely trying. Robert Kirkman, who created the original comic series and was closely involved in the TV adaptation from the beginning, has always been clear about something that I think is genuinely right. The show he was most interested in making was not about zombies. The zombies are a plot generator, a pressure system, a way of applying constant external force to the question he was actually interested in. What does sustained catastrophe do to people over time? What does it do to their relationships, their values, their capacity for trust and hope, and ordinary human kindness? That question is what makes the show's best episodes genuinely affecting rather than merely entertaining, and it's a question that even Wildfire is at least asking, even if it can't quite sustain the answer for 42 minutes. Since we're moving through the seasons, and since season 2 has some strong episodes and some significant growing pains that are mostly well documented, let me skip ahead to season 3, which is, by any reasonable measure, one of the show's finest and most sustained runs of television. And then I want to talk about how that season ended. Season 3 of The Walking Dead is genuinely excellent. I don't say that as a hedge before the criticism, I mean it as context that makes the criticism land properly. The show in season 3 was operating at a level that justified all the praise it had accumulated. The prison setting gave the narrative a physical architecture that the story desperately needed. The governor gave it a human antagonist who was frightening in ways that Walker's simply can't be. David Morrissey's performance is one of the best things the entire franchise ever produced. Controlled, charming, and underneath all of it, completely unhinged in a very specific way that takes real skill to sustain for 16 episodes. The prison versus Woodbury dynamic gave the show something it had occasionally lacked, a clear, dramatic question. Not just, will the characters survive the zombies, but what does survival cost and who gets to decide? The Governor's Woodbury is a society that has preserved its comforts at the expense of its humanity. Rick's prison group is trying to hold on to its humanity under conditions that make that increasingly difficult. That tension is rich and sustainable, and Season 3 plays it beautifully for most of its run. And then it ends in an episode called Welcome to the Tombs, which aired on the 31st of March, 2013. And the ending is, well, let's talk about it properly. The governor attacks the prison. This is the moment the entire season has been building toward. The confrontation that was always going to happen. The war between these two groups and what they represent. Rick's people have been preparing. Merle, in his own strange, devastating way, tried to give them an advantage by taking Michonne to the governor and failing to hand her over. That storyline ended with Merle's death, which is one of the most genuinely well-earned character exits in the show's history. Michael Rooker made Merle complicated and human in a way the writing sometimes struggled to keep up with, and his death carries weight precisely because the show finally found a reason for him that wasn't just comic relief and racism. So the stakes going into Welcome to the Tombs are genuine. The governor has the numbers and the weapons. Rick's group has the preparation and the ground. The question is whether Woodbury can be stopped, and what it will cost either side. What actually happens is this. The governor's army attacks the prison, encounters some resistance, panics, and retreats. Then the governor pulls his vehicles over on a road somewhere, flies into a rage, and machine guns most of his own people. He and his 2 lieutenants drive away. The war is over. That's it. That is the season-long conflict resolving itself. To be precise about the episode's other events, Andrea is trapped at Woodbury, trying to escape while Milton, who the governor has stabbed and left to die, and turn in the same room as her, slowly becomes a walker. She nearly escapes. She gets Milton's pliers off the floor with her toes, which is a genuinely tense piece of staging, and almost gets herself free, but the walker gets to her first. She is bitten before Rick's group can reach her. She dies in the room, with Michonne at her side, off-screen, and then Rick sees a vision of Laurie on the road as the surviving Woodbury residents are brought to the prison. End of season. Andrea's death is the one genuinely affecting thing in this episode, and even that comes with an asterisk, because the show had spent much of season 3 treating Andrea in ways that frustrated the audience. Her relationship with the governor, her apparent inability to see through him despite the mounting evidence, her continued presence in Woodbury, all of it felt like the writers keeping her away from the main group for plot reasons rather than character ones. By the time she dies in Welcome to the Tombs, there's genuine sadness in it, because Laurie Holden is a good actress who gave Andrea more than the writing usually deserved, but the death also feels, uncomfortably, like the show tidying up a problem it had created for itself. There's a version of Andrea that could have been one of the show's most interesting characters. In the first season, she's positioned as someone grappling with the question of whether survival is worth it. Her arc in Wildfire and the season 1 finale is about choosing to live despite everything, and it's one of the better character journeys in that early run. Season 2 began doing interesting things with her as she learned to fight, found purpose, found a degree of self-determination. And then Season 3 handed her to the governor and used her primarily as a vehicle for his storyline rather than her own. The Andrea problem is worth naming because it's emblematic of something the show occasionally did with its women characters, gave them positioning in the narrative that served the plot's needs rather than their own internal logic. It's a failure of a specific kind, and the Season 3 finale's handling of Andrea's death, which is sad and a little rushed and not quite as devastating as it should be, reflects a season that never quite figured out what to do with her. The governor's exit is the real issue, though. He's been the most compelling villain the show has ever built, and he resolves himself by shooting his own army on a country road and driving away with 2 people. The moment the bullets start, it's over. There's no final confrontation, no reckoning, no sense that the prison group has earned this outcome. It just happens because the governor loses his composure and destroys his own advantage. David Morrissey plays the breakdown well. He usually does. But the scene is staged and written as though the writers realised they'd boxed themselves in and needed the governor to self-destruct, rather than dealing with the consequences of the conflict they'd built. The result is a season finale that ends one of the show's finest seasons without actually ending anything. The governor is still alive. Woodbury still exists in a vestigial form, folded into the prison. The war is over not because it was won, but because one side simply stopped fighting. And the emotional aftermath, Rick seeing Laurie, the new Woodbury refugees arriving, happens in a vacuum, without the catharsis the season had earned. It's also worth acknowledging what Woodbury represented as a concept, because the show built it carefully, and the finale's failure to properly close it out leaves that concept somewhat unresolved. Woodbury is the show's argument about the cost of comfortable lies, a community that has preserved its normality through a combination of controlled information, strategic violence, and a leader who decides what the population is allowed to know. It's a recognizable social configuration, dressed in post-apocalyptic clothing, the gladiatorial fights in the arena, the wall that's described as keeping walkers out, but actually keeps people in, the clean streets and the electricity and the ease of life that have been bought with a currency most of the community doesn't know they're paying. Woodbury is interesting because it works. The people there are, broadly, safe and fed, and not entirely unhappy. The question the show is asking, what are you willing to accept in exchange for security, is a genuine one, and the governor's Woodbury makes that question urgent and specific. Welcome to the Tombs doesn't close that argument. The Woodbury survivors are absorbed into the prison community, and the show moves on. What Woodbury meant, what it cost, what its model of survival reveals about the choices people make when they're frightened, never quite gets its reckoning. Season 3 is still great television. Welcome to the Tombs is a genuine disappointment, and it established, unfortunately, a pattern that would repeat in various forms across the seasons that followed. The show building to enormous confrontations and then finding peculiar, anticlimactic ways to not quite have them. Something else worth acknowledging about the Governor's Season 3 arc and why its finale feels so anticlimactic in such a specific way. The show had, across 16 episodes, built Philip Blake as a figure of genuine complexity. Not the cheap complexity of a villain who does bad things, but has a sad backstory. That's a different and thinner kind of characterization. The governor's complexity was more fundamental. He believes he is right. He believes that what he has built at Woodbury is worth protecting, and that the cost of protecting it, the violence, the deception, the extraordinary brutality, is a cost that leadership requires him to pay. He has genuinely convinced himself of this, and that self-conviction, which Morrissey plays with extraordinary control, is what makes the character frightening in a way that mere sadism wouldn't be. The governor isn't a monster who has forgotten he's human. He's a man who has developed an entirely coherent internal logic that happens to justify monstrous things. That's a lot to invest in a character. It requires the story to pay it off, at a scale that matches the investment. A machine gun fired into a field of his own people, followed by a drive into the darkness. That's not the scale of payoff the character earned. It's the scale of a story that couldn't figure out how to end itself and defaulted to self-destruction. The governor himself would return in season 4, which says something. The show couldn't let him go, even after fumbling his exit, and his return brought with it one of the more frustrating mid-season detours in the show's history, which brings us, in a gentle sort of way, to season 4's back half. Here's something I find genuinely interesting about Dead Weight, the 7th episode of season 4, which aired on the 1st of December 2013. The episode that precedes it, Live Bait, episode 6 of the same season, is actually rather good. I don't say that grudgingly. Live Bait is a quiet, strange, genuinely effective character study about a broken man finding something that might be a reason to live, which then gets systematically dismantled because that's who the governor is. David Morrissey plays the entire episode at a register the show rarely asked of him, softer, more genuinely human, and it works precisely because you know what's underneath it. Live Bait takes the governor away from the main narrative for an episode and uses that distance well. It shows you something new about a character the show had invested enormously in, and it does so without feeling like a detour. It feels purposeful. Dead Weight is the follow-up to that, and it is a considerably less purposeful piece of television. The episode continues where Live Bait left off. The governor, now going by Brian Herriot, an identity he has grafted onto himself from a name on a postbox, has integrated himself into a camp of survivors led by a man named Martinez who knew him from Woodbury. Martinez is trying to run a functional small community. The governor is trying to figure out what he is now. There's a woman, Lily, whom he has feelings for. There's her daughter Megan, whom he's become protective of. There's tension with two brothers in the camp, Pete and Mitch, one of whom is sensible and the other of whom is not. What happens across the episode is a slow consolidation of power. The governor goes on a supply run with Martinez and the brothers. They encounter some walkers and some unpleasant evidence of how survivors have been treating each other, and by the end of the episode the governor has, almost as a matter of instinct, begun manoeuvring himself back into the position of authority he can't seem to stop wanting. Martinez ends up in a walker pit. Pete ends up in a lake. The governor is in charge. And the problem is that none of this is surprising. Not in a "the show is too predictable" way. That's a different criticism. In a more specific way, the episode is telling you things about the governor you already fully understand. He cannot stop being who he is. His violence is reflexive and self-perpetuating. Even when he finds something soft and human to hold on to, the predatory competitiveness underneath reasserts itself. That's the governor. That has been the governor since his very first scene. Live Bait worked because it showed you the softness. Dead Weight mostly just shows you the inevitable collapse of that softness, which you could already see coming by the end of Live Bait. The episode is repeating an argument the previous episode had already made. There's also the matter of timing. Season 4, up to this point, has been running an excellent storyline back at the prison. A flu outbreak, questions about leadership, some of the show's most interesting character work since season 1. Herschel's quiet heroism during the illness arc is one of the finest extended sequences in the franchise's run. The group has been divided and struggling in genuinely compelling ways, and for 2 consecutive episodes, the show abandons all of that to follow the governor at a camp the audience has never seen, with characters it barely has time to register, doing things that mostly confirm what was already known. One thing that's worth noting, the episode contains one good scene, and it happens quite early. The governor finds a painting inside a camp caravan, or rather, he finds half a painting, a landscape that someone has cut in two, the other half missing. He stares at it for a moment, and something passes across Morrissey's face that is more interesting than anything else in the episode. It is a brief wordless acknowledgement that the governor is himself a halved thing, and that whatever was on the missing side of that canvas is gone permanently. That image is genuinely beautiful. It doesn't save the episode, but it's the kind of moment that reminds you what the show was capable of when its craft and its instincts aligned. There's also the matter of Merle, whose death in the episode immediately before this two-parter is one of the season's finest hours. This Sorrowful Life, the episode in which Merle decides to take Michonne to the governor on his own terms, then changes his mind, then tries to assassinate the governor alone, is exactly the kind of character payoff the show managed brilliantly when it had done the work of building a character properly. Merle's death, and Daryl finding his turned brother and having to put him down, is devastating and specific and earns every second of what it cost. Deadweight arrives in the immediate aftermath of that and asks you to care about people you barely know in a situation that largely confirms things you already knew. The contrast is instructive. Deadweight resolves, as it must, with the governor deciding to take what he wants and return to the business of being a threat. The mid-season finale, Too Far Gone, episode 8, is one of the finest hours of television the show ever produced. Herschel's death, the governor's end, the prison's destruction. All of it lands with the kind of weight that only works when the seasons preceding it have been doing their jobs properly. Season 4, despite this 2-episode detour, had earned that finale. It's worth spending a moment on Too Far Gone here, because understanding what makes it work helps explain what makes Deadweight feel insufficient. Too Far Gone earns every piece of what it delivers because it understands the emotional stakes it's playing with. When the governor raises his machete over Herschel, it is devastating because Scott Wilson had made Herschel, across 4 seasons, into one of the show's most genuinely beloved figures. Not beloved in a saccharine way, but beloved in the way of a person you have come to know and trust, someone whose perspective and moral weight have mattered to the story. His death means something enormous, because his life meant something enormous. Deadweight is, among other things, an episode that doesn't give us enough time with any of its new characters for their fates to matter at the same level. Pete and Mitch and Martinez and Tina are all functional in their narrative roles, but they are narrative roles rather than people, and the episode doesn't quite have the space to change that. The governor, by contrast, is already fully formed, which means Deadweight is showing us a man we already understand in situations that mostly confirm what we already know. It's just that Deadweight was, by its own gentle admission, the price of the ticket. Since we're on the topic of things the show made you wait through to get to the good bit, and I realise that sounds like I'm building to something tense, so let me reassure you, I'm really not. We're just having a conversation. Let me move along to Season 6, because Season 6 is where the pattern becomes, by any honest account, a problem rather than an occasional inconvenience. Season 6 of The Walking Dead is, in retrospect, the season where the relationship between the show and its audience started to visibly strain. Not break, or not yet, but strain in ways that were audible if you were paying attention. The ratings were still enormous. The viewership was still loyal. But certain decisions in the writing were starting to register as something other than bold storytelling choices. The specific decision I'm talking about happens in an episode called Heads Up, which aired on the 15th of November 2015. And to understand why Heads Up feels the way it does, you need to go back 5 episodes to an episode called Thank You. In Thank You, which aired the 4th of October 2015, Glenn and Nicholas are on a supply run that goes catastrophically wrong. They end up surrounded on top of a dumpster, a herd of walkers pressing in from every side. No escape. Nicholas, who has been a complicated, somewhat cowardly character the show has been slowly trying to rehabilitate, looks at Glenn and says thank you, and then shoots himself. He falls off the dumpster and takes Glenn with him, and they both tumble into the crowd of walkers below, and the camera shows what appears to be Glenn being devoured, screaming blood everywhere. Stephen Yoon's name was removed from the closing credits. Ewan himself was evasive in interviews. Showrunner Scott Gimple sent a statement to The Talking Dead that was so carefully worded it was practically a legal document, something about seeing Glenn in some form again. The show then spent 4 episodes not mentioning Glenn at all, cutting away from any questions about his fate, essentially pretending the whole thing hadn't happened, while simultaneously knowing that every viewer in the audience was thinking about nothing else. 5 weeks later, Heads Up opens with a sequence that reveals Glenn was under the dumpster the entire time. Nicholas fell on top of him. The walkers fed on Nicholas, while Glenn, tucked underneath the body, survived. He eventually crawls out when the herd dissipates, ties a bandage around an arm wound, finds a water bottle thrown to him by Enid from a nearby building, and carries on. The internet, as you can imagine, had quite a lot to say about all of this. Here's what's genuinely interesting, though. The mechanics of Glenn's survival are plausible. Just barely, but plausible. If you're going to accept the basic physics of the thing, and the show has never been particularly committed to literal zombie realism, then a body landing on top of you as a makeshift shield from a herd is not completely absurd. The problem isn't the logistics. The problem is the manipulation that preceded the reveal. The 5 weeks of deliberate ambiguity, the credit removal, the producer statements carefully engineered to neither confirm nor deny. That wasn't storytelling. That was showmanship. And there's a difference. Good storytelling uses uncertainty to build emotional investment. What happened here used uncertainty to drive engagement, which is a subtly different thing, and which tends, when the audience catches on, to produce exactly the kind of reaction it produced. Not relief, but irritation. Heads Up, as an episode, is not beyond the Glenn resolution, particularly bad. The other storylines running through it, Morgan's continuing reluctance to embrace lethal violence, the building tension with Ron and the Anderson family, Enid and Glenn's brief alliance, are perfectly functional. The episode ends with the watchtower collapsing into Alexandria's wall, which is a good cliffhanger in the traditional sense, and Glenn's reunion with Maggie, which happens wordlessly through a pair of binoculars at a considerable distance, is quietly moving in a way the show hadn't quite managed for a while. But the Glenn survival scene itself lands with a kind of muted thud, because the audience has spent 5 weeks being strung along, and by the time the reveal comes, the emotional register is closer to fine thank goodness than to genuine relief. The manipulation cost the show the catharsis it had arguably earned. The weeks of non-answers left the audience feeling managed rather than surprised, and there's a meaningful difference between those two experiences. This is the first instance of something that would become a recurring problem in seasons 6, 7, and 8. The show prioritizing its audience's engagement with the mystery over the actual emotional experience of resolving it. An audience that feels played will forgive a show once, maybe twice. The Walking Dead would test this tolerance fairly extensively in the seasons ahead. There's an argument, which I've heard made in good faith, that the entire Glenn ambiguity storyline was simply a mistake in the shooting and editing of the original dumpster scene, rather than a deliberate creative decision, that the scene was intended to be ambiguous rather than to look like a confirmed death, and that the removal of Yoon's credit and the producer non-answers were a kind of retroactive management of a situation that had spiraled beyond what anyone intended. I can't verify this. I don't think anyone outside the production can, but it's worth noting as a possibility because it changes the moral calculus slightly. Deliberate audience manipulation is one thing. A production mistake that snowballed into something uncomfortable is a different thing. Still frustrating, but differently frustrating. What isn't in dispute is how the audience received it. The weeks of silence followed by the dumpster reveal felt manipulative regardless of intent, and one of the subtler costs of the Glenn storyline, beyond the immediate frustration, was that it made the show's audience more suspicious of subsequent ambiguous moments. Every subsequent scene in which a character appeared to be in mortal danger would now be filtered through the question, Is the show actually killing this person, or is this another dumpster situation? That erosion of instinctive narrative trust is a real cost, and it's one that accumulated across the seasons that followed. It's also worth pausing on what Glenn Rhee meant to the show, independent of this particular storyline, because his eventual death in the Season 7 premiere is among the most devastating things The Walking Dead produced. And understanding why helps explain why the manipulation of the Season 6 dumpster sequence felt so specifically wrong. Glenn is the show's optimist. He's the character who believes, in the face of everything, that people are worth saving, that the world is worth rebuilding, that survival alone isn't enough if you lose your humanity in the process. That belief is what drives him to run supply missions, to take risks for strangers, to maintain his relationship with Maggie in a way that represents the possibility of an actual future, rather than just continued survival. Glenn is the show's argument that decency is worth maintaining. His death in Season 7 is devastating, precisely because the show has spent 6 seasons building that argument through him. The dumpster fake-out tried to use that investment as a manipulation tool, and audiences noticed. And speaking of which, since Heads Up feeds directly into the mid-season finale that followed it, let's talk about that. Start to Finish aired on the 29th of November 2015 as the mid-season finale of Season 6. It holds a 35% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is the lowest rating of any episode in the series by that measure. That's worth sitting with briefly. The entire run of The Walking Dead, across all 11 seasons, produced 177 episodes, and of those, the one that critics liked the least was this one, a mid-season finale, an episode that was supposed to be a punctuation mark on the first half of the season, a moment of genuine consequence. What actually happens in Start to Finish is harder to summarize with energy, because the episode is largely defined by the absence of energy. The watchtower that collapsed at the end of Heads Up has brought a herd of walkers into Alexandria through the breached wall. The community, which has been largely safe up to this point, is suddenly not. People scramble for cover. Rick and a group take shelter in Jesse Anderson's house, covering their tracks with walker gore to buy time. Deanna Monroe, the community's leader, a woman who has been one of the more thoughtful supporting characters of the season, is bitten in the chaos. The wolf that Carol has been keeping as a prisoner escapes. Morgan and Carol fight about their differing philosophies on killing, which is a conflict the show has been circling for several episodes. Deanna's death, which happens near the end of the episode, is the one thing in Start to Finish that is genuinely affecting. Tova Feldshuh gave Deanna a warmth and intelligence that the show didn't always know how to use. And her goodbye, the conversation she has with Rick about what they've both been trying to build, the way she eventually goes out, is moving and specific and earns its emotion. It's the kind of moment that reminds you what the show was capable of when it gave its actors room. Everything else in the episode is, to be honest, stalling. The structure of a mid-season finale carries certain expectations, not necessarily an action climax. The show was always smarter than that when it was working well, but some form of consequence, some change in the state of things, a door opening or closing in a way that makes the second half of the season legible. What Start to Finish delivers instead is a holding pattern. Everyone is in danger, nobody resolves anything, and the episode ends with the group preparing to walk through the herd in ponchos made of walker gut, which is a technique the show had already used in Season 2, and which lands here with the mild familiarity of a known solution rather than the inventiveness of a new one. The wolf escaping with Denise as a hostage is a thread that matters eventually, but not in this episode. The Ron almost shoots Carl moment is staged as a tension beat, but doesn't pay off in any way the episode follows through on. The Morgan-Carol conflict, which is the show's attempt to have a philosophical argument about the cost of idealism, is interrupted before it reaches any conclusion. The Morgan-Carol dynamic is worth noting specifically because it's one of the more genuinely interesting philosophical threads the show was running in Season 6, and Start to Finish handles it poorly. Morgan and Carol represent two answers to the same question. What do you do with people who are dangerous? Carol's answer, eliminate the threat before it can act, is pragmatic and unsentimental and has been proven effective across the seasons. Morgan's answer, that all life has value, that killing should be the last resort and not the first, is idealistic and, in certain episodes, clearly shown to have costs. The show is at its most interesting when it refuses to declare either position simply correct, when it holds both positions in tension and asks the audience to sit with the discomfort of not having a clean answer. Start to Finish puts Carol and Morgan in a room together with this tension fully loaded and then interrupts the scene before it can discharge. Whatever the episode might have said about these two people and what they believe is left unsaid, pending a second half of the season that will need to earn the payoff. This episode couldn't quite set up properly. There is a credit card trick that episodes like this one rely on. Fill the runtime with movement, keep characters in danger, ensure that the production values are high enough that it doesn't look like nothing is happening, even when nothing is happening. Start to Finish is competent at the surface level. The direction is clean, the performances are fine, the walkers look good, but competent execution of a wheel-spinning script is still a wheel-spinning episode. The critics' consensus on Rotten Tomatoes reads, Start to Finish fails to live up to The Walking Dead's potential with a mid-season finale that is both dull and frustrating. Which is, I think, about right, not vicious, not incendiary, just accurate. One thing I keep returning to with Start to Finish is the specific problem with the Alexandria setting as the show had been using it. The community, walls, solar power, pre-built houses, a semblance of normal life, was introduced in the second half of Season 5 as both a genuine sanctuary and a warning sign. These people have been too safe for too long. They haven't been tested. The gap between their understanding of the world and Rick's group's understanding of it is a genuine fault line that the show had been building toward for episodes. A mid-season finale that uses the collapse of Alexandria's wall as its central event should be the moment that fault line produces its earthquake. Start to Finish has the earthquake, but not the consequences. The walkers come through the wall, people hide, and the episode ends with the situation unresolved, which is a legitimate storytelling choice. Not every mid-season finale needs to produce a casualty or a resolution, but only if the hiding itself is interesting. The best of the show's quieter episodes are quiet in a way that's full of internal movement. The characters are doing something, feeling something, discovering something, even when the external action is still. Start to Finish is quiet in a way that's just quiet. There's also a technical issue with the episode's central premise that I suspect bothered viewers without them quite being able to articulate it. The walker herd that comes through the wall is enormous, several hundred at minimum, probably more. Alexandria is a residential community with houses and yards and streets. The logistics of what happens next should be significant. Where do all these walkers go? How do you clear a community of this size of a herd this large? The show, in the second half of Season 6, would eventually address this through an extended storyline about clearing Alexandria and taking the community back. But in Start to Finish itself, the sheer scale of the problem is introduced without the episode engaging with that scale in any meaningful way. The herd comes in, the people hide, and the episode ends. The mismatch between the size of the threat and the smallness of the episode's response to it is part of what creates the dull and frustrating quality the critics identified. Season 6 would eventually find its footing again in the second half. There are some genuinely strong episodes in the back half of that run, but the mid-season point, which should have been a moment of genuine dramatic weight, lands without much force, and the viewer comes back from the winter break having spent the intervening weeks not quite anticipating what comes next, which is the opposite of what a good mid-season finale should do. Before we leave Season 6 entirely, I want to spend a little time on a different kind of problem. Not the spectacle that underdeploys, but the episode that arrives at exactly the wrong moment. Always Accountable aired on the 15th of November, 2015. It's the 6th episode of Season 6, and it follows a mission involving Daryl, Abraham and Sasha that goes wrong in the opening minutes, ambushed by people the audience won't recognise yet. Forced to separate, each group navigating a different stretch of unfamiliar Georgia. Daryl ends up alone in a burned-out forest, encounters a small group of survivors on the run, gets his crossbow stolen, finds a fuel truck. Abraham and Sasha sit in a car and circle each other in a way that is meant to establish the romantic tension between them. At the episode's end, Daryl finds a lead on the fuel truck, and a small figure on his radio says something that sounds like, "Help." That small voice, incidentally, turns out to be Glenn, who has survived the dumpster and is trying to reach the group. The show doesn't confirm this in Always Accountable. It lets it sit there as an ambiguous note, which is either a clever narrative choice or an extension of the Glenn is maybe dead manipulation, depending on your level of patience for that storyline by this point. Daryl's encounter with the survivors in the burned forest is the episode's main event. The survivors are Dwight, Sherry and Tina, three people the audience will eventually come to know quite well, particularly Dwight, who becomes one of the more genuinely interesting characters in the show's later seasons. Here, though, they're strangers. Dwight is frightened and practical and suspicious. Sherry is trying to keep things together. Tina is ill and fragile, and dies before the episode ends, which is a moment staged to have more weight than it earns, since the audience has known Tina for approximately 40 minutes. And here is the specific problem with Always Accountable that goes beyond the episode itself, and into the territory of structural planning. On the 3rd of October 2015, the show appeared to kill Glenn. It was one of the most discussed moments in the show's recent history. It generated genuine outrage, genuine grief, and genuine obsessive theorizing. The audience was raw. The audience wanted answers. And the show, across the next 5 episodes, gave them almost everything except answers. Always Accountable runs Daryl, Abraham and Sasha away from the main Alexandria storyline for an entire hour to meet people the audience doesn't know yet, in a side story that will matter eventually, but doesn't meaningfully matter right now. And it airs while the Glenn question is still open and unresolved and consuming all of the available emotional energy in the show's audience. The episode is not badly made. Daryl's interactions with Dwight have a careful, specific dynamic that Norman Reedus handles well. He's alert and slightly wrong-footed in a way that feels right for the situation. Abraham's subplot is genuinely funny in places. His monologue about the phrase "dolphin smoothly" is deeply strange and clearly written by someone who was having a good time with a character they liked. And the burned forest is visually striking in a way the show occasionally managed when it was thinking carefully about what the camera was doing. There's a broader structural challenge worth naming here that goes beyond Always Accountable specifically. By season 6, The Walking Dead had expanded to 16 episodes per season, up from the 13 of season 5 and the 16 of season 4, but with a significantly more complex ensemble and a broader physical world to navigate. 16 episodes is a lot of television to fill, and the show, by this point in its run, was beginning to feel the weight of that commitment. The natural episodes, the ones that would have existed regardless of runtime pressure, were still there. But surrounding them were episodes that exist partly because the season needed to be 16 hours long, and the writers were faced with the not entirely comfortable task of expanding material that might have been better served by compression. Always Accountable is not purely a filler episode. The Dwight introduction matters. The fuel truck matters. The radio signal at the end matters. But it's an episode that could have achieved all of those things in considerably less time. And the hour-long format asks it to stretch a smaller story across more space than it comfortably occupies. Michael Cudlitz, who played Abraham, is worth a brief mention here because he's one of the people the show underused fairly consistently across his run. Abraham Ford is a character who functions in the writing primarily as muscle and comic relief. The big guy who says blunt things and occasionally saves the day with brute force. Kudlitz found considerably more in the character than the writing gave him, and the Sasha subplot of, always accountable, the two of them circling each other in a growing awareness of mutual feeling, is one of the more quietly affecting things the episode does, precisely because Kudlitz is bringing specificity to material that doesn't always demand it, but the timing undermines everything. An episode exploring a side mission involving supporting characters, landing 5 weeks after a moment that felt like the loss of a series laid in a season that had already asked a great deal of its audience's patience, registers not as a compelling detour, but as a delay. The show needed to address what its audience was thinking about, and it chose not to for another 2 weeks. Always accountable bears the cost of that choice. Now, I want to mention Season 6's finale before we move into Season 7, because the finale of Season 6 contains one of the most controversial creative decisions in the show's entire run, and it's one that the show paid for across much of the following year. Last Day on Earth aired on the 3rd of April 2016. It is the Season 6 finale. It is 90 minutes long. It is the episode in which Negan makes his debut. And it is, by the measure of fan reception, one of the most divisive pieces of television the show ever produced. Not because it's badly made, but because of a single decision that appears in its final 90 seconds and which the show then had to live with for 6 months. Let me give you the episode properly though, because context matters here. The first hour and 15 minutes of Last Day on Earth follows Rick's group trying to transport a critically ill Maggie to Hilltop's doctor, who is the nearest available medical help. Maggie is pregnant, something is wrong, and every road they take is blocked by saviors, Negan's people, whom the group has encountered and killed in several outposts across the season, but whose leader they have not yet met. Each blockade is bigger than the last, a chain of walkers hanging between telegraph poles, a pile of belongings from people the group recognizes. Eventually, they abandon the vehicles and try to move through the forest on foot, carrying Maggie on a stretcher. This escalation is, in design, effective. The idea of every escape route closing off, the sensation of a net tightening, that's good dramatic architecture. The problem is the pacing of it. The episode is 90 minutes, and approximately 60 of those minutes are the group encountering a blockade, retreating, trying a different route, encountering another blockade, retreating. The repetition that was meant to feel suffocating starts to feel a little like the show was uncertain how to fill the runtime. And then Negan arrives. The group is captured at night, out in a field, kneeling in a line. Other survivors have been brought from Alexandria and Hilltop. There are torches, there is darkness, and from a recreational vehicle, at the end of a long crowd of saviors, a man emerges carrying a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, and he is immediately, overwhelmingly, the most compelling presence the show has produced in years. Jeffrey Dean Morgan's Negan is extraordinary, and I want to say that clearly and without hedging, because it is absolutely true, and because the criticism of this episode is not criticism of that performance. The monologue he delivers, establishing the rules of this new world, the economics of Negan's particular kind of cruelty, the strange charisma of a man who genuinely believes he's doing something reasonable, is one of the great villain introductions in television drama. Negan's logic, as he presents it, is almost coherent. He's not irrational. He's made a calculation. He's telling the group with terrible clarity what the new arrangement looks like. The selection process, the eeny, meeny, miny, mo, the awful, playful deliberateness of it is genuinely difficult to watch. That's by design. It's meant to be. And then the camera cuts to a first-person POV. The bat comes down. We hear the sound of it landing. We hear the screaming. The screen goes black. End of season. The critical and fan response to this decision was, to put it delicately, not warm. The show had spent the entire season building to this confrontation. It had killed off beloved characters in Thank You, with the apparent Glenn death, already stretching its audience's patience. And now, in the season finale, after 90 minutes of build-up, it refused to show you who died. The answer was held for 6 months, until the Season 7 premiere. Scott Gimple, the showrunner, argued that the intention was to put the audience in the position of the characters, helpless, uncertain, not knowing who had been chosen. It's an interesting argument. It's not an argument that satisfied many people. The comics comparison is worth making here, and not in the usual "the books are always better" way. In Robert Kirkman's comic series, the equivalent moment, Negan's introduction, and the death that follows, is presented without ambiguity. You know immediately who has died. The horror is in the certainty, not the uncertainty. Kirkman's creative judgment, in this specific instance, turned out to be correct. Certainty is more devastating than ambiguity, because certainty doesn't give the audience anywhere to hide. Ambiguity, paradoxically, offers a kind of emotional buffer. As long as you don't know who died, you can still choose not to believe it. The cliffhanger of Last Day on Earth allowed its audience to spend 6 months in a state of not quite having to grieve, which is its own kind of comfort, and which is precisely the wrong emotional experience for this moment in the story. Here is what the decision actually cost. It drained the emotional energy from the very moment it was trying to create. The death of Glenn or Abraham, and it turned out to be both, should have been devastating in real time, with the audience experiencing the grief of the loss in the moment of the loss. Instead, 6 months of theorizing had made the moment theoretical. By the time the Season 7 premiere confirmed what had happened, the audience had already processed several of the possible outcomes, had rehearsed various versions of grief, and arrived at the actual answer slightly numb. The episode itself, taken in isolation, is a competently made piece of television. The production values are high. The cast is doing what is asked of it. Negan works completely. But Last Day on Earth cannot be taken in isolation, because the decision at its end determined how the season that followed would be experienced, and the damage that decision did to the show's relationship with its audience was not insignificant. Here is what I mean by that specifically. The summer of 2016, between the Last Day on Earth finale and the Season 7 premiere in October, produced a specific cultural experience for Walking Dead fans that I don't think has quite happened before or since with a television show. The theorizing wasn't just idle speculation, it became a kind of industry. YouTube videos ranking the likelihood of each character's death were watched millions of times. Articles were published across major entertainment sites on what felt like a weekly basis. The producers appeared at Comic-Con and were asked about it and gave no useful answers. The cast members were photographed at events and dissected for clues in their body language and expressions. All of that is, in a sense, engagement. It demonstrates investment. But investment kept in a state of prolonged artificial suspension tends to curdle into something that looks more like frustration than enthusiasm. By the time October arrived and the Season 7 premiere resolved the cliffhanger with the revelation that both Glenn and Abraham had died, a significant portion of the audience was watching not with the wide-open emotional readiness that a devastating death scene requires, but with a kind of grim, vindicated fatalism. The grief was real, but it was muted, because the grief had already been partly processed in the abstract over the course of 6 months of theorizing about who might be dead. The show had done something unusual. It had pre-experienced its own most important moment alongside its audience, and in doing so had made that moment smaller than it should have been. Since we're talking about the Season 7 premiere, and the premiere itself is a different kind of conversation, let me spend a moment on it before we get into the season's real problem episodes. This is a shorter section because, The Day Will Come When You Won't Be, the Season 7 premiere, which aired the 23rd of October 2016, is not a bad episode. I want to be honest about that before we go any further, because honesty seems like the right approach when we're sitting comfortably in the dark, and there's no particular reason to be unkind about things that aren't actually unkind. The premiere resolves the cliffhanger. Abraham dies first, Glenn dies second. The show handles both deaths with genuine craft. Glenn's death in particular, which mirrors a sequence from the comic in a way that lands with real horror, is one of the most viscerally distressing things the series ever put on screen. Stephen Yeun's performance in those final seconds is heartbreaking. Lauren Cohan's reaction to it is arguably even harder to watch. The episode is polarizing, and the polarization is reasonable. Some viewers felt the violence went beyond what storytelling required, that the extended brutality was less about narrative consequence and more about demonstrating what the show could get away with. Some felt the extended Rick torture sequence, in which Negan psychologically demolishes Rick across the episode's middle section, went on past the point of emotional purpose. These are not irrational responses, but it is a purposeful episode. It is an episode that knows what it wants to do and does it. The grief and shock are real. The performances are extraordinary. Jeffrey Dean Morgan continues to be a genuinely compelling presence. The technical execution is strong throughout. There's a specific moment in the premiere worth noting. The conversation between Negan and Rick in the RV, the extended psychological breakdown that Negan engineers through increasingly extreme demands, culminating in Rick nearly being forced to cut off Carl's arm. That is genuinely extraordinary television in the way it uses sustained discomfort to establish a new power dynamic. Andrew Lincoln is extraordinary in this sequence. The way he moves through the stages, defiance, calculation, resistance, and then the specific quality of something breaking, is performed with the kind of physical and psychological precision that the show demanded of Lincoln constantly across 8 seasons, and that he almost never failed to deliver. That the sequence goes on perhaps slightly longer than it needs to is a quibble, not a condemnation. The debate around the premiere's violence is worth acknowledging honestly. The argument that the episode went too far in its depictions of Negan's killings, that the level of graphic detail served shock more than story, was made by thoughtful people, not just squeamish ones. The counter-argument that the horror of Negan's violence needed to register at a visceral level for the season to work as a sustained examination of tyranny and trauma is equally valid. Both things can be true simultaneously. The episode is genuinely effective, and some of what makes it effective is also uncomfortable to sit with. Where it belongs in this conversation is as context, because the Season 7 premiere set the emotional stakes for a season that would then spend much of its remaining 15 episodes not quite meeting them. The strategy of Season 7, once you understand it, is clear. Take the show's most powerful characters, strip them of their agency and self-determination, and make them small under the weight of Negan's dominion, before eventually restoring them to themselves in a way that feels earned by the suffering it cost. It's a legitimate dramatic structure. The problem is that watching people be ground down, episode by episode, across a full television season is significantly more difficult to sustain an audience through than the theoretical version of it sounds. Season 7's ratings decline, which was significant and noticed, wasn't solely the product of the premiere's brutality or the cliffhanger's manipulation. Though both contributed, it was also the product of a season that asked its audience to spend 16 episodes watching characters they loved be broken, with the promise of eventual restoration that always seemed to be one more episode away. That's a hard emotional bargain to maintain, and the episodes that weren't quite good enough within it, episodes like Swear, felt the weight of the season's overall emotional demands in ways that they might not have in a different year. And one of the episodes that most conspicuously failed to meet them arrived as episode 6. Swear aired on the 20th of November, 2016. It is the 6th episode of Season 7, and its IMDb user rating makes it one of the lowest rated episodes in the entire series. Given what the show was asking its audience to carry at this point in the season, the grief of Glenn and Abraham's deaths, the ongoing horror of Negan's dominion, the slow psychological dismantling of Rick Grimes that the season had committed to, the decision to spend episode 6 following Tara Chambler on a supply run adventure is, in retrospect, remarkable. Let me describe what happens because I think it's important to understand the full extent of what the show asked of its audience here. Tara and Heath are on a supply run. Heath drives away at some point, in unclear circumstances. His exit is handled with such awkwardness that it registers as what it actually was, which is an actor, Corey Hawkins, who had taken a film role and needed to be written out temporarily in a way the writers hadn't quite figured out. Tara washes up on a beach. She's found by two young women. She's taken to a community called Oceanside, which is entirely female because the Saviors killed all the men and boys over 10 years old. The community has been in hiding, surviving off the coast, refusing all contact with the outside world. Tara eventually escapes. She promises not to tell anyone about Oceanside. Oceanside is, on paper, a genuinely interesting idea. A community shaped entirely by a single catastrophic act of Negan's cruelty, existing in hiding because exposure has meant destruction, making choices about survival and isolation that carry real weight. The show would eventually use Oceanside in compelling ways. In Swear, though, the community mostly functions as a setting for Tara to navigate, with characters who haven't had enough time on screen to feel fully dimensional. The timing makes it worse, and the same structural problem that made Always Accountable feel like a detour applies here with added weight. The emotional stakes were simply higher. 6 episodes in, the show's audience was still sitting with the deaths of Glenn and Abraham, and an hour following Tara on a supply run was not the acknowledgement that moment required. Swear does register this eventually. There's a moment near the episode's end where Tara returns to Alexandria and finds out what happened, and her grief is real, and Alana Masterson plays it with genuine feeling. That moment works. The rest of the episode is a side quest that the audience, at this point in the season, was in no state to take. Here's a thing worth noting about Season 7's construction overall, and this is a critique of the season rather than just this episode. The decision to split the group across multiple locations, Alexandria under Negan's thumb, the Kingdom with Ezekiel, Hilltop with Maggie and Sasha, Oceanside hiding on a beach, allowed the show to do character-focused individual episodes. In theory, that's a valid structural choice. In practice, it meant that the season frequently paused the central story to visit a supporting storyline, and the gap between the emotional stakes of the main narrative and the gentler stakes of these side episodes was sometimes jarring. And here's the specific problem with Oceanside as a concept in this episode, as distinct from its uses later in the series. The community's backstory, every male over 10 years old killed by the Saviors, is genuinely devastating in the abstract. It should function as another data point in the argument the season is making about the scale of Negan's cruelty and the breadth of its reach. But the episode doesn't have time to make that argument effectively, because it's spending most of its runtime on Tara's survival adventure and escape. The horror of what happened to Oceanside is mentioned and then set aside in favour of logistics. The show would use Oceanside more effectively in Seasons 8 and 9, when the community's history and its relationship to the war with the Saviors had more room to matter. Here in Swear, it's a setting that deserves more than it gets. A note on Alana Masterson, who plays Tara, because she deserves it. Masterson is a genuinely capable actress who was given a character that the show was never quite sure what to do with. Tara's function in most episodes is warmth and humour. She's the person who lightens a scene, who provides the kind of human connection that prevents certain storylines from becoming too oppressive. That is a valuable function. It's just not always the most interesting function to write for, and the show occasionally seemed to confuse capable of being funny with can carry a standalone episode without additional support. The tonal demands of a Tara-centric episode are different from the demands of a Rick-centric one, and Swear doesn't quite find the register that would make those differences work in its favour. And since we're talking about Season 7's pacing, let me say a brief word about a different kind of failure. The kind where the structural problem is spread across a whole season rather than concentrated in one episode. Season 8 of The Walking Dead was built around a promise. 2 seasons, 2 years of television, had been spent establishing Negan as the show's ultimate antagonist, building toward a war between Rick's coalition and the Saviors that the narrative had described in genuinely epic terms. The all-out war arc from Robert Kirkman's comic series is a large-scale, consequential conflict, and the show's version of it arrived in October 2017 with enormous expectations. The King, the Widow, and Rick aired on the 19th of November 2017. It is the 6th episode of Season 8, and by this point in the all-out war arc, a specific texture had emerged. Not the texture of large-scale war, but of a show circling its own central conflict, filling the space between battles with character episodes that don't quite have the weight to carry themselves. The episode has 3 parallel storylines, as the title suggests. Ezekiel, still shattered by the deaths of most of his people at the hands of the Saviors in the previous episode, has locked himself in his room at the kingdom. He refuses to speak to his subjects, refuses to be their king, refuses to do the performance of leadership that he's always understood, with a kind of sad self-awareness to be a performance. Carol is trying to reach him. Jerry is trying to reach him. Neither quite manages it. Kari Payton, who plays Ezekiel, does excellent work in a subplot that deserved more room than the episode can give it. At Hilltop, Maggie is dealing with a group of Savior prisoners taken in battle. The question is what to do with them. Keep them as leverage? Execute them? Let them go? The moral weight of this question is real, and the show is right to engage with it. This is the kind of ethical complexity that the best seasons of The Walking Dead handled exceptionally well. The problem is that the subplot doesn't resolve anything here. The prisoners are kept, pending decisions that will come later. We're meant to feel the tension of an unresolved moral dilemma, but what we mostly feel is an unresolved moral dilemma. Rick, meanwhile, has gone to the junkyard to try to negotiate with Jadis and the scavengers. The Jadis situation is worth discussing briefly because it represents a particular kind of The Walking Dead creative decision that the show was making more frequently by this point. The introduction of a community so deliberately eccentric that it calls attention to its own contrivance. The scavengers communicate in a broken, clipped idiom that is meant to suggest a post-apocalyptic evolution of language. In practice, it mostly suggests a writing room that ran out of ideas for how to differentiate them and landed on, they talk weird. Pollyanna McIntosh is doing her best. The best isn't quite enough to make Jadis feel like a real antagonist, rather than a plot device with unusual syntax. The result is an episode that is spreading itself across 3 storylines, none of which have quite enough room to breathe, in a season that had promised to be the show's biggest and most satisfying narrative. And the gap between the season's stated scale and the actual experience of watching it episode to episode is one of the more genuinely disappointing things the show did in its later years. Ezekiel's storyline in this episode is worth returning to briefly because it represents the show at something close to its best and worst simultaneously. Kari Payton is extraordinary as Ezekiel, a character who is, by his own admission, a performance. Ezekiel was a zookeeper before the apocalypse. He found a tiger named Shiva, which is a fact that sounds absurd and is somehow handled with complete dignity by the show. He built himself into a king, with a court and a throne room and a theatrical manner of speaking, because he understood that what his community needed was not just a competent leader, but a symbolic one. He is performing hope. He knows he's performing it, and that self-aware performance of something worth preserving is one of the more poignant ideas the show had in its later years. When the kingdom loses most of its people to the saviors in the episode before The King, the Widow and Rick, and when Ezekiel loses Shiva defending his survivors at the end of that episode, that's devastating. Genuinely devastating. It strips the performance away and leaves a man who built himself into something he no longer believes he can be. That deserves a full episode. It deserves the space to sit with, to explore what it means to grieve not just the dead, but the version of yourself that was possible before they died. The King, the Widow, and Rick gives it a subplot. Season 8 is not all The King, the Widow, and Rick. There are good episodes in the run. The finale, in which Rick makes the decision to spare Negan and treat his surrender as the beginning of something rather than the end of something, is interesting and divisive in the right way. People disagreed about it for reasons that reflected genuine values, not just frustration. But this episode, landing at the midpoint of the season, is emblematic of a war that the show was telling rather than dramatizing. This is the distinction that matters, I think, when you're trying to understand what went wrong in the middle seasons. The Walking Dead at its best showed you things. At its worst, it told you that things were happening and then showed you the administrative aftermath. The King, the Widow, and Rick is the administrative aftermath of 3 battles in an episode that mostly marks time between them. Season 8's other genuine creative disruption, the death of Carl Grimes, which aired in the mid-season finale, is a conversation for a different video. But it's worth naming briefly because the decision to remove Carl, who in the comic series survives to become the emotional centre of the post-Negan world, changed what the show could ultimately be about. Carl was the clearest articulation of what all the suffering was building toward. The show continued without him and found ways to fill that space, but the loss was structural as well as emotional, and you can feel it in the seasons that followed. After season 8, something genuinely interesting happened. The show attempted a creative reinvention. There is a scene in Stradivarius, the 7th episode of season 9, which aired on the 18th of November 2018, where someone finds a violin in an abandoned music shop, holds it briefly, and sets it down. The show named the episode after it. I'm genuinely not sure what the title is gesturing toward thematically. Something about artistry and craftsmanship surviving into the new world, perhaps, or the idea of things worth preserving that nobody can quite figure out how to use anymore. Whatever it is, the image captures something about the episode itself, small, specific, and a little uncertain of its own meaning. Season 9 had arrived as a genuine reset. Angela Kang had replaced Scott Gimple as showrunner, and the change was immediately legible. Sharper dialogue, freshened character dynamics, a time jump of 18 months that made the setting feel genuinely new. And then, midway through the 9th episode, Rick Grimes was apparently killed in a bridge explosion and evacuated by helicopter, removing the show's lead character in a way that nobody had quite anticipated. The season managed that transition better than most people expected, and genuinely found new life in the Whisperers, Alpha and Beta, a community of survivors who wore walker skin and walked among the herds, who turned out to be an extremely effective antagonist concept. But before all of that arrived, there's episode 7. The episode is set in the gap between Rick's departure and the introduction of the Whisperers, which means it lands in a transitional space. The season is still navigating. Daryl has been living alone in the woods with his dog. He hunts. He has set up a camp near the river where Rick disappeared. He is still, in some private way, looking. Carol and Henry are travelling through the forest seeking Daryl, with Henry hoping to train as a blacksmith at Hilltop. Meanwhile, Michonne is leading a small group from Alexandria, including Magna's group, new arrivals the season has been slowly introducing, toward Hilltop. Siddiq is with them. None of this is without purpose. The episode is establishing the new state of the world, moving pieces into position for the second half of the season, doing the kind of structural groundwork that long-form television requires. And some of what it does works. The Daryl in the Woods material has a quietness that suits the character, and the Carol-Daryl reunion, when it comes, is warm in the way those two characters always manage to be warm with each other. But Stradivarius is also an episode in which not very much happens. Michonne's group walks toward Hilltop. Carol and Henry find Daryl. Daryl agrees to take Henry to Hilltop. That's the architecture of the hour. It's a transitional episode, and like Wildfire back in Season 1, it does its transitional job without particularly distinguishing itself. There's something specific that the post-Rick era needed from its quieter episodes. The show had just removed its protagonist, and that's not a minor adjustment. Rick Grimes was the character around whom the audience's sense of orientation was built for 8 seasons. Repositioning an ensemble without him requires establishing new centers of gravity, and that work is visible in Stradivarius, but it's happening at a pace that feels slower than the transition required. What the episode does well, the physical world of Season 9 is genuinely well realized, with a visual care that Kang's leadership brought to the production. What it doesn't do well, give you a compelling reason to be watching this particular hour over any other. What makes Stradivarius more notable than Wildfire is the context it sits in. Season 9 had opened with genuine creative momentum. The first 2 episodes had done real work establishing the new dynamics of the post-war world, and by episode 7, in the specific stretch before the Whisperers arrive, and the season finds its second wind, there's a sense of the show idling at a light that hasn't quite changed yet. There's something interesting to sit with here about what Season 9 was attempting. The time jump that opened the season, 18 months forward, the world rebuilt into something with more pastoral structure, communities trading and cooperating in ways that felt genuinely new, was a creative decision that required the audience to accept a significant amount of unseen narrative. What happened between the end of the war and the start of Season 9? How did these communities establish their current relationships? Why is Michonne now isolationist? Why has Daryl retreated into the woods? The show answers some of these questions in subsequent episodes, but Stradivarius is one of the episodes in the new season's middle stretch where the unanswered questions create a slight sense of floating, of being in a world whose internal logic hasn't fully arrived yet. The Whisperers, when they finally appear, solve this problem by providing the season with a centre of gravity. Alpha, played by Samantha Morton with complete commitment to a genuinely unsettling performance, is the Whisperers' leader, and she works in ways that the season setup hadn't quite suggested possible. The Walker skin concept, which sounds on paper like it might tip into self-parody, works because the show plays it with absolute seriousness, and because the performers inside the skins manage to convey genuine menace. The Whisperers are frightening in a new way. Not the Governor's calculated brutality, not Negan's theatrical dominance, but something older and more fundamental, a group that has chosen to become part of the world's horror rather than resist it. All of that is in episodes that come after Stradivarius. The episode itself is the pause before the season discovers what it's about. Season 9 gets significantly better. The Calm Before, which airs later in the run, is genuinely devastating and one of the finest episodes in the show's entire history. Stradivarius is the corridor between the show's transition and its reinvention, and corridors are rarely the most interesting part of the journey. And now let me move into Season 10, because Season 10 is where the show produced some of its most interesting work, and also, in a very specific batch of episodes, its absolute worst. Find Me aired on the 1st of March 2021. It is the 17th episode of Season 10, part of the extended run that was added to the season after production delays caused by the pandemic, and it is, by the measure of IMDb's user ratings, one of the lowest rated episodes outside the 2 that we'll discuss in a moment. It exists to do a specific piece of narrative work, to establish Daryl's emotional life during the years between Rick's disappearance and the present day, and to introduce a character named Leah, who will play a role in Season 11. The episode structure is a flashback sequence. Daryl and Carol are hunting in the woods when they come across a cabin, and the sight of the cabin triggers Daryl's memories of the years he spent living alone by the river, searching for Rick. In the flashbacks, we see Daryl encounter Leah, a woman who has been living in the cabin with a dog, one of the last survivors of a group she'd been part of. She is self-sufficient, private, and deeply cautious. Daryl is self-sufficient, private, and deeply cautious. They orbit each other for a while. They fall into something that looks like love. It ends badly, as things tend to end for Daryl. Here is what Find Me is trying to do, and it's genuinely a worthwhile thing to try. It wants to fill in the emotional landscape of the years the audience didn't see, to give Daryl's grief over Rick and his solitary existence in the river camp a texture beyond what the Season 9 montages could convey. The instinct is correct. The years after Rick's apparent death are exactly the territory worth exploring if you want to understand where Daryl is emotionally when Season 10 finds him. The problem is Leah herself, or more precisely, the way the episode constructs her relationship with Daryl. The show has never mentioned Leah before this episode. She appears from nothing, falls into an intense romantic relationship with the show's most guarded character, and then disappears, all within the span of flashback sequences across an hour of television. For the relationship to carry the weight the episode needs it to carry, the audience would need to feel something for it. For the audience to feel something for it, the relationship would need time and specificity that Find Me simply doesn't have room to provide. Lynn Collins, who plays Leah, is working hard. The material she has isn't quite there, and the dynamic between Leah and Daryl, two people who are both defined by their reluctance to let anyone in, is not quite specific enough to feel like this particular relationship, rather than a genre of relationship the show has attempted before. Norman Reedus, to his considerable credit, finds things in the Daryl in the Woods sequences that are genuinely moving. The scenes of him at the river, the daily rituals of searching for a person he can't quite accept is gone. Those have real feeling. The scenes with Leah are more effortful. The Daryl and Carol frame of the episode, in which the flashbacks are punctuated by scenes of their fractured present-day friendship, is doing something interesting, in theory. The idea that Daryl's hidden history with Leah explains things about where he is now with Carol. But the two things don't quite synthesize in the way the episode needs them to. The final argument between Daryl and Carol on the cliff feels like the destination the episode was always heading to. And it's well performed, but it lands in the air rather than on solid ground, because the emotional architecture underneath it isn't fully built. Find Me is the kind of episode the show produced when it had ambitious intentions and insufficient time to execute them. It is not incompetent, it is, in several individual moments, affecting, but it fails at the specific task it sets itself, which is asking the audience to feel the weight of a relationship they're meeting in retrospect, through fragmented memories, without the foundation that would make that weight real. There's a broader pattern here that's worth naming, because Find Me isn't the only instance of it. The Walking Dead, in its later seasons, occasionally introduced romantic relationships for its major characters through retroactive revelation, showing you a relationship that already happened, rather than one you're watching develop in real time. The implication is always that the audience's existing attachment to the character is sufficient to transfer to the new relationship, that Daryl and Leah can coast on the years of Daryl investment the audience already has. The problem with that assumption is that emotional investment is specific. What the audience has is a feeling about Daryl. That's not automatically a feeling about Daryl with Leah, which is a different and smaller thing that needs its own foundation. The show did this better in other contexts. The slow, patient development of Daryl and Carol's relationship across 10 seasons is a masterclass in exactly the kind of specificity that Find Me lacks. That relationship was built through accumulated small moments, through specific exchanges and choices that accumulated meaning over time, through the particular texture of two people who understand each other without needing to fully explain themselves. It works because it was earned incrementally, and the audience was present for all of it. Find Me tries to accomplish something similar in 42 minutes of flashback. I don't think 42 minutes is enough. One more thing worth noting about the season: 10 bonus run as a format, because it contextualizes Find Me in a way that makes the episode's failures make more sense. The 6 bonus episodes were, by the nature of the production situation, pandemic delays, smaller budgets, limited locations, operating under constraints that the main season run didn't face. Some of those constraints produced genuinely interesting results. One More works beautifully as a Gabriel and Aaron two-hander precisely because it has no choice but to stay small and intimate. And that intimacy serves the story. But the Daryl-centric bonus episodes, Find Me in particular, needed more production room to deliver what they were promising. A flashback romance set across multiple years, showing a relationship that changed a person fundamentally, is an expensive thing to do properly. You need time, locations, and enough scenes to build genuine texture. Find Me doesn't have those resources in the amounts the story required, and the result shows. And now for the last 2 entries in this evening's list, which happen to be the 2 episodes that by almost every available measure the show's audience liked the least of all. Splinter aired on the 11th of April 2021. It is part of the same extended season, 10 bonus runners, Find Me, and it is in a very different way from Find Me, an episode that knows what it wants to be, but can't quite get there from where it starts. The episode follows Princess. For those who need a brief reminder, Princess is Juanita Sanchez, an eccentric and exuberant survivor who Daryl's group meets at the start of the 6th episode of the bonus run. She's been alone for a long time, which has affected her in ways that are visible from the first scene. Paula Lazaro plays her with considerable energy and a lot of heart, and Princess is genuinely a character worth caring about. The show's instinct to give her depth is the right one. In Splinter, Princess and her companions, Eugene, Yumiko, and Ezekiel, have been captured by soldiers from the Commonwealth. They're being transported in boxcars, each kept isolated. The Commonwealth, which will become the central antagonist force of the final season, is being deliberately opaque here. The soldiers won't identify themselves or their organisation. The destination is unknown, and the audience is meant to share Princess's uncertainty about whether these people are dangerous, indifferent, or something else. Princess, isolated in her boxcar, begins to experience a destabilizing PTSD response. Her past, a history of abuse she's only glimpsed at in earlier episodes, is pressing in. She repeatedly attempts to escape her containment, moves between boxcars, has interactions with her companions that may or may not be fully real, loses track of what's happening and what she's imagining. By the end of the episode, she's been captured again. Everyone ends up roughly where they started. That circular structure is the episode's central problem. The loop: Princess leaves, comes back, leaves again, comes back again, is clearly designed as a formal expression of her psychological state. When you're in a PTSD spiral, you don't progress linearly. You return to the same points from different angles. That's a legitimate narrative idea. The trouble is that loop structure works best when each iteration of the loop reveals something new, deepens our understanding of the character, or shifts the emotional register in a way that makes the repetition feel meaningful rather than just repetitive. Splinter does this in places. There are moments in the Princess material, specific images from her past, flashes of her younger self, the way her mind uses the present danger to process older ones, that are genuinely well observed. The episode is trying to do something real with trauma, and it occasionally succeeds. But by the 3rd or 4th time, Princess has left the boxcar and then been forced back into it. the formal choice starts to feel like running out of ideas rather than a deliberate artistic decision. And the very last scene, the entire group, all four of them, knocked unconscious and back in captivity, underlines the circularity in a way that feels more deflating than devastating. There's also the question of timing. The Season 10 bonus run was, as a format, always going to live and die by the quality of its individual episodes, since each one was largely self-contained and needed to work on its own terms. Splinter is asking the audience to spend an entire episode in close proximity to a single character's psychological unravelling, without much of the broader narrative to anchor it. That's a considerable ask. The episode isn't quite equal to it. Something the episode is genuinely attempting, and which deserves acknowledgement even in a discussion of its shortcomings. The representation of dissociation and trauma-triggered unreliable perception is handled with more sensitivity than you might expect. Princess's backstory, which the show had established in previous episodes, largely through her manic energy and her repeated statements about how long she's been alone, involves a history of abuse that left her with a set of responses to perceived threat that don't always correspond to the threat that's actually present. When she's in the boxcar and the Commonwealth soldiers approach, her mind is not processing just the soldiers. It's processing every previous time she's been trapped. Every previous time authority has meant danger. Every previous time she's been isolated and afraid. That's a real experience. The episode is trying to render it visually, through the instability of her perceptions. And the instinct is correct. The execution is inconsistent. Some of the flashback imagery is too vague to land with the force it needs. Some of the present-day moments are restaged in ways that clarify the unreliability, perhaps too neatly, but the attempt is there, and it's genuine, and that matters in a landscape of television where trauma is still frequently reduced to backstory rather than treated as something that actively shapes how a character moves through the present moment. Lazaro does good work, and I want to say that clearly, because it's true, and because the episode's failures are structural rather than performative. Princess deserved a better vehicle. The show gave her an interesting episode to be the centre of, and then put that episode in a run of television where the stakes it could generate were inherently limited. The Commonwealth as an antagonist concept is worth a brief note here, because the way Splinter introduces them tells you something about how the show was navigating its final seasons. The Commonwealth, which the Season 11 run would eventually reveal as a large, organised, class-stratified society with its own political tensions and a charismatic but morally compromised leader, is one of the more genuinely interesting ideas the show had produced in years. It's a different kind of threat from what preceded it. Not a warlord, not a cult, not a community that's made one catastrophic decision. A system, an actual social structure with its own internal logic and its own victims. That's worth exploring. Splinter introduces this concept by making the Commonwealth completely opaque. The soldiers won't identify themselves, won't say where they're going, won't explain anything. That opacity is meant to create mystery. It creates a certain amount of it. But mystery without texture can quickly become mystery without interest. And 42 minutes of Princess in a boxcar with an enigmatic captor doesn't give the audience enough of the Commonwealth to be genuinely curious about it. It gives them just enough to know something is coming. The Season 11 run would handle the Commonwealth considerably better, given more room and more episodes to develop it properly. But the introduction here, in Splinter, is more of a placeholder than a reveal, which is fine as a function but less satisfying as an experience. And then there's the last one. Diverged aired on the 18th of April 2021. It is the 21st episode of Season 10, part of the same bonus run, and it holds the lowest IMDb user rating of any episode in the entire 11-season run of The Walking Dead. 177 episodes across 12 years of television, And this is the one that rated lowest. It is a 42-minute episode about a rat. Let me be precise, because precision is deserved here. Daryl and Carol separate at the start of the episode, continuing from the tension in Find Me. Carol returns to Alexandria. Daryl goes into the woods with Dog. The episode follows each of them in parallel for 42 minutes. In the woods, Daryl encounters a walker, makes a snare trap, gets a cut on his hand, and forages for food. Dog gets a small wound. Daryl patches them both up. The end. At Alexandria, Carol arrives to find that something is wrong with the solar panel setup. She attempts to fix it. She discovers a rat has gotten into the machinery somewhere. She makes soup, presumably for Daryl, who she's clearly hoping will come home, and the soup spills. She tries to catch or find the rat. The rat at the end of the episode simply leaves on its own. Carol sits on the porch. Daryl comes home. That is the episode. Nothing in it changes anything. The rat situation resolves itself. Carol and Daryl reconcile, but not because of anything that happened in Diverged specifically. They were already heading that direction before the episode began. The solar panel problem is either fixed or left for another day. It doesn't come up again in any meaningful way. The soup was spilled. That's the closest thing the episode has to a consequence. I want to be careful here, because I think there's a version of this defense that doesn't work, and a version that almost does. The almost working version goes like this. Diverged is a deliberately small episode about how enormous events fracture ordinary life. Carol and Daryl have been through world-ending things together. They're currently not speaking, and so Carol is at home trying to fix a solar panel and chase a rat, because that's what you do when the world has fallen apart and your closest friendship has fractured. You do the small functional things because there's nothing else to do. The rat that simply leaves is the universe reminding you that some problems just resolve without your involvement. The spilled soup is the cost of distraction. It's a meditation on the gap between the scale of grief and the smallness of daily life. That reading is available. I am not entirely dismissing it. But here is the thing about that reading. The execution doesn't support it. For a deliberately small episode to work, and there are examples of this kind of television that do work, quiet episodes where nothing much happens, but the texture of nothing happening is rich and specific enough to sustain the runtime. The details have to be doing emotional work. Every choice of what to show has to be earning its screen time. The rat has to mean something, even if what it means is small. In Diverged, the rat is just a rat. The soup is just soup. The solar panel is just a solar panel. Melissa McBride is doing what she always does, finding the interior life of a character in moments of apparent stillness. But the script isn't giving her the material that would make those moments accumulate into something larger. She is a good actress in a bad episode, which is a familiar situation for the show's later seasons. There's also a Daryl subplot that is so underdeveloped as to be almost invisible. Norman Reedus is in the woods. He makes a trap. He finds some food. His dog is hurt. They're fine. This isn't character revelation. It's filler, and the show has no excuse for filler at this point in the run. What's particularly striking about Daryl's section of Diverged is what it doesn't do with a genuinely rich situation. Daryl, by this point in the series, is in the woods because of a fracture in his most important relationship. He is living alone, again, the way he lived alone before the prison, before any of the communities, the woods as default, the woods as the place he goes when the human world gets too complicated. That's interesting. That's a character returning to a coping mechanism that the show has established across 10 years. And there's something worth exploring in what it means when the progress of a decade of connection can be undone by a single argument. But the episode doesn't explore it. Daryl is in the woods. He makes a trap. Things are fine. For Diverged to work as the kind of small interior episode it's clearly attempting to be, it would need something like what Clear does in Season 3, a contained situation that acts as a lens for the larger emotional reality, in which every detail of the present moment reflects something about where the character is internally. Clear works because the ruined town and Morgan's obsessive barricades and the decisions Rick makes during that hour all speak to the same thing the episode is about. What it costs a person to survive in isolation and what returning to connection requires. The details carry the meaning. Diverged doesn't get its details to carry anything. The solar panel is just a solar panel. The woods are just woods. And so the episode remains at the surface of its own ambition. The bonus batch has its genuine highs. Here's Negan, chief among them. But Diverged lands at the bottom of the batch, and then some way below it. What makes it the lowest rated episode in the show's history isn't that it's offensive or badly crafted or technically incompetent. It's that it's empty. It doesn't give you anything to hold on to, and it asks you to stay with it for 42 minutes anyway. For a show that, in its best seasons, had made you feel as though every scene was building towards something, that emptiness registers as a kind of failure of faith, the show no longer believing, in this particular episode, that it owed its audience anything more than a running time. The rat left on its own. In its small, unheroic way, that detail is almost a perfect emblem for the episode's relationship to its own narrative ambitions. The problem resolved without being solved, and then everyone went home. I want to say one more thing about Diverged before we move on, because I think it's genuinely interesting. The episode is trying to say something about the Daryl and Carol relationship, specifically about the strange, particular way that two people who know each other completely can still manage to be in the same space without connecting. The episode is interested in the texture of an estrangement between people who aren't estranged in any dramatic sense, just not quite where they used to be. That's a real human experience. The fact that the episode can't quite find the visual and narrative language to express it doesn't mean it shouldn't have tried. Melissa McBride and Norman Reedus have, across the run of the show, one of the most genuinely specific and well-observed long-term character relationships in television drama. The way Carol and Daryl understand each other without explaining themselves, the shorthand they've developed through years of shared catastrophe, that relationship has real weight, and a good episode built on a moment of difficulty within it could be something extraordinary. The show has done quieter, more interior Carol and Daryl episodes that worked, not because they were action-driven, but because the character work was specific and felt and true. Diverged just isn't one of them. But the fact that I know what a good version of this episode might look like is itself a testament to what the show had built, with these two people, and that's worth sitting with, even at the bottom of the ratings table. The Season 10 bonus run, taken as a whole, is genuinely uneven. Here's Negan is excellent. Home has some strong material. One More gives Gabriel and Aaron a quietly effective bottle episode. Diverged and Splinter are the low points of the batch, and they're low enough to pull down the average considerably. But the batch exists because the show's audience kept showing up, kept wanting more time in this world, and that loyalty, 12 years of it, is the thing that makes even the worst episodes worth talking about. And that, I suppose, is roughly where we've landed tonight. We've covered a lot of ground, from the quiet transitional drift of Wildfire in Season 1, all the way to the rat that walked out of Carol's house in Season 10. From the anticlimax of the Governor's Season 3 exit to the empty 42 minutes of Diverged. From Glenn under the dumpster to Tara on her island. From the all-out war marking time to the boxcar loop that left everyone where they started. The thing I keep coming back to, sitting here thinking about all of this, is how much the worst episodes of The Walking Dead reveal about the best ones. The duds show you what the show needed to succeed, because the duds are precisely what happens when one or two of those conditions aren't met. You need something to happen that changes the state of things. You need characters who are facing choices that matter. You need the small moments to be doing emotional work rather than just filling space between the bigger ones. When all of those things are present, the show is extraordinary. When any of them are missing, when the episode is transitional without being purposeful, or structural without being human, or small without being specific, you end up with a Carol chasing a rat around her kitchen. And yet the show produced, across its 11 seasons, some of the finest hours of dramatic television of its era. The Grove, in season 4, in which Carol makes the most devastating decision any character in the show's run is ever asked to make, and in which Melissa McBride does something that would be a career-defining performance for almost any other actress in any other context. No Sanctuary, the season 5 premiere, which resolves the Terminus storyline with a ferocity and satisfaction that the audience had been waiting for all summer, and Too Far Gone, which paid off a season of building with Herschel's death and the prison's destruction in a way that still lands. Clear, in season 3, in which Rick finds Morgan again, and the episode does something the show rarely allowed itself. It stopped completely, stayed in one location, and let the weight of the world press down on two broken people in a room together. These are the episodes that justify 12 years of loyalty. These are the episodes that explain why the bad ones sting in the specific way they do. Not because the show was generally bad, but because the show proved repeatedly that it could be exceptional. And so the times when it wasn't feel like a betrayal of a standard it had set for itself. But here's what I also think is true. The fact that we're talking about this, that these episodes are memorable in their way, that the lowest point of a 12-year television run is a woman dealing with a minor household pest rather than something genuinely harmful or offensive. There's something almost comforting in that. The Walking Dead's failures are very rarely failures of ambition or decency. They're failures of execution. The show almost always wanted to do the right thing. It just sometimes couldn't quite get there from where it was standing. The franchise continues, as you know. Daryl Dixon is off in France, which remains a sentence that takes some adjusting to. Dead City has Maggie and Negan in a New York overrun with the dead, which is exactly as chaotic as it sounds. The Ones Who Live gave Rick and Michonne the love story conclusion the original series couldn't quite deliver, and managed to do it in a way that was, at moments, genuinely moving. The world keeps going, the show keeps expanding, and somewhere in there, presumably, there will be episodes that work brilliantly and episodes that don't, because that is the nature of telling stories across this much time and this many hours of television. I find I'm slightly fond of all of these episodes, even the bad ones, in the way you're fond of the awkward chapters in a book you love. They're part of the thing. They're part of what it meant to be a Walking Dead viewer. To show up every week not quite knowing whether you'd get something extraordinary or something that made you look at the clock. That uncertainty, the possibility of greatness alongside the possibility of a rat subplot, is part of what it means to care about a show for 12 years. One thing I notice, having spent this much time with the series' weaker moments, is that the failures cluster in particular ways around particular seasons. The early seasons 1, 2, 3 have their weak episodes, but those episodes tend to be weak in the way that young, ambitious storytelling is sometimes weak. Overreaching, not quite landing, trying something that doesn't work. The failure modes of Wildfire or Welcome to the Tombs are the failure modes of a show still figuring out its own rules. The middle season, Neiman 6, 7, 8, have their weak episodes in a different register entirely. Those failures are the failures of a machine that knows its own rules too well and has started following them mechanically, producing episodes that tick the structural boxes without doing the human work those structures are supposed to contain. Start to finish. Swear. The King, the Widow, and Rick. These are episodes that look like The Walking Dead and sound like The Walking Dead, but don't quite feel like it, because the feeling came from something underneath the structure that the show had partially lost access to. And the late season failures, Find Me, Splinter, Diverged, are something else again. These are the failures of a show trying to reinvent itself within constraints it can't quite escape. Ambitious, occasionally inspired, but not always equal to what they're reaching for. That arc, from the fresh failure of ambition to the mechanical failure of formula to the strained failure of reinvention, is in some ways a portrait of what happens to any long-running creative enterprise. The shape of the failure changes as the enterprise matures, and reading the failure shapes tells you where the show was in its own life cycle. The Walking Dead's worst episodes are, in that light, a kind of autobiography. For now, though, it's late, and we've done a fair bit of walking through the dead tonight. If this was the kind of company you like to fall asleep to, one long unhurried conversation about a show that, even at its worst, managed to be worth talking about, then I hope it did what it was supposed to do. There's more where this came from. I'm planning a video about the spin-offs at some point, how each of them handled the inheritance of the original show, which ones found their own identity, and which ones just borrowed the furniture, and possibly a look at the show's very best episodes, which feels like the right companion piece to this one. That feels like a good evening's worth of conversation, whenever you're ready for it. But for tonight, this is where we leave it. The walkers are quiet. The camp is settled. Sleep well.